Good morning, and thank you for joining this session. My name is Glenice Deterville. I am presently a PhD candidate at the JSGS campus in University of Regina. I also work with the government of Saskatchewan as a policy analyst in the Ministry of Agriculture. So today I will be presenting a comparative analysis of policy framing, participation and adaptive governance in water governance and agricultural climate adaptation across three Canadian prairies. And they are Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The purpose is not to suggest that one approach is superior, but rather to examine differences in governance cultures, institutional framing, and also the participation structures. But before we begin, I wish to acknowledge that the city of Brandon is located on Treaty 2 territory, the traditional homelands of the Dakota, Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree, the Cree, and the Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land and their ongoing contributions to our communities, culture, and shared future. We honor the treaties and affirm our responsibility to live, learn, and work in a good way with all nations who call this land home. Agricultural regions in the Canadian prairies are under mountain climate stress, with more frequent droughts, variable rainfall, and also severe flooding. For example, in the 2021 prairie drought was among the first severe in decades, devastating crop yields and underscoring vulnerabilities in water governance. Because Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, they share similar ecological pressures but adopt different institutional approaches, they provide a valuable basis for comparative analysis. This study is motivated by the need to understand how institutional choices shape our adaptive capacity. The central question driving this analysis is how the variations in policy framing and stakeholder participation influence the adaptive capacity of agricultural water governance systems in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The analysis here, it draws on three complementary perspectives. So we have what you call the discursive institutionalism by Smits of 2008, which emphasizes the role of ideas and discourse in shaping institutional behavior. We also have the policy paradigm theory, which distinguishes first, second, and third order policy change, and that will be explained a little more. And we also have now the power analysis, where you have particularly looks three dimensions of power to examine whose voices are included and also excluded. To assess the participation, I employed a split ladder participation by Hulbert and Gupta 2015. Dr. Hulbert is presently my supervisor at JSGS, and which differentiates better instrumental consultation and more substantive co-governance. So this basically is a comparative qualitative case study. The central question driving this, relying on document analysis of policy strategies, watershed plans, and also stakeholder submissions from 2010 to 2025. For example, I used the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, Saskatchewan's 25-year water security plan, and also the Manitoba's watershed district strategies were among the key texts examined. The analysis used framing and discourse analysis to identify dominant narratives, and the split ladder was used to evaluate participation depth and also inclusiveness. This design, it also allows me to systematically compare across the provinces while being attentive to context-specific differences. Though they share the climate vulnerabilities, the prairie provinces, they differ markedly in institutional culture and also governance style. Alberta emphasizes technocratic and market-based approaches, often, often linking adaptation to competitiveness and industry innovation. Saskatchewan, it favors more centralized regulatory stability, relying heavily on long-term infrastructure planning. Manitoba, however, employs more participatory and polycentric models shaped by its flood management system, such as the Red River Floodway and community-based watershed planning. These contrasts provide a window into how governance cultures influence adaptive capacity. To interpret these provinces frame how they frame water governance and adaptation, I applied the Peter Hall's typology of policy change. So we have the first order change where you have adjustments to the settings of existing policy instruments. For example, raising or lowering the water pricing or quotas without altering the underlying policy framework. The second order change, you have the modification of instruments themselves, such as shifting from voluntary guidelines to regulated licensing. And then you have the third order change, which is a complete paradigm shift, a rethink of the overarching goals and problem definitions that guide policy. But in the prairie provinces, we see these types of change represented differently. Alberta, it demonstrates mainly a first order adjustment, emphasizing efficiency, technological fixes, and market based mechanisms while keeping the overarching paradigm intact. Alberta's climate leadership plan, for instance, focused heavily on carbon pricing and innovation funding. Saskatchewan, it demonstrates a second order change, where instruments like allocation rules and infrastructure planning are modified. As the 25-year Water Security Plan emphasizes water supply and infrastructure expansion, but maintains a centralized state led orientation. Manitoba demonstrates elements of the third order change, where policies incorporate socio-ecological framings and emphasize watershed districts as vehicles for shared responsibility. This typology helps us see that the provinces are not simply doing more or less adaptation, but are moving along qualitatively different directions or different pathways of policy change. The participation also varies in depth and form between the three provinces. Using the split ladder framework, I distinguish symbolic consultation from substantive participation. Symbolic consultation here occurs when governments invite input, but decision making power remains firmly with central authorities. Stakeholders may provide feedback, but agencies, priorities, and final decisions they are already shaped in advance. Substantive participation involves the stakeholders not only voicing concerns, but actively shaping priorities, co designing the solutions, and holding ongoing influence throughout the implementation. Across the prairies, the provinces, we notice that Alberta, participation tends toward a symbolic consultation, where advisory councils such as the Alberta Water Council, they are consulted, but policy direction it remains dominated by industry and institutional actors. Saskatchewan, consultation it exists but is largely procedural. Public meetings and advisory committees are held, but The influence on agenda setting is very minimal. Manitoba, the participation is closer to substantive engagement as seen in the watershed district model, where communities and municipalities they collaborate on planning and management. Still, participation is uneven across the regions. So, what looks like participation across all three provinces has different levels of influence and impact when assessed more closely. Adaptive capacity here, it would refer to the ability of governance systems to adjust policies. And as we can see in the chart, we have the participation and the power, uh, a contrast between each province. So you have the framing logic, which Alberta is technical economic, Saskatchewan regulatory, and Manitoba is more socio ecological and participatory. So basically, it's a description of what I have read simplified. So, four key findings emerge from this comparative analysis. The framing matters. By defining water as an economic commodity, a regulatory object, or a socio ecological system, provinces pre structure which adaptation strategies are prioritized and which are sidelined. Participation depth, it varies. While all provinces use the language of engagement, in practice, Alberta and Saskatchewan lean toward a symbolic or procedural form, while Manitoba it engages in more substantive, though still evolving participation process. Power is unevenly distributed. Using the Look's three dimensions of power, we see how agenda setting power often it excludes marginalized actors, particularly the indigenous groups, even where participation mechanisms exist. Distinctive pathways emerge. These differences are not about who is ahead or behind, but about distinct trajectories of adaptive governance shaped by institutional culture and framing choices. The policy implications here we have that you can promote inclusive discourse and equity based frames where policies are framed more broadly as socio ecological risk. Participation structures are more likely to enable collaboration and community based approaches. Symbolic consultation, as seen in Alberta and Saskatchewan, may provide legitimacy but does not significantly expand the adaptive capacity. Substantive participation, as in Manitoba's watershed districts, it provides a broader knowledge and legitimacy but faces coordination challenges. These are not prescriptions for which approach is best. Instead, they highlight the comparative dynamics, of how different framings and participation mechanisms shape adaptation in district ways. And this research it contributes in three ways: theoretically by advancing discursive institutionalism and power analysis in governance studies; methodologically by combining the discourse analysis with the split ladder framework; and empirically by showing how governance cultures in the Canadian province shape adaptation outcomes. And in conclusion, the Prairie provinces they face common climate challenges but pursue divergent governance trajectories. These findings reinforce the importance of policy framing and participatory structures in shaping adaptive outcomes. Future phases of this research, it will extend to the analysis through stakeholder interviews and comparative engagement, actually to capture the voices and the experiences beyond the policy documents. I thank you.